Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. They put her in the back seat at her own wedding, and Lagos rolled past like a fast river pretending to be calm. The city's breath hot with diesel and pepper, and the chatter of 1,000 plans colliding at once. But that was later, before the veil learned how to tremble, before the driver's mirror caught her eyes like a hook. There was the softer beginning that moved at the speed of an evening prayer, the way life shuffles its feet before it runs. In Yaba, mornings wore the uniforms of bread sellers and newspaper boys, and dusk always sounded like distant laughter bounced off zinc roofs. Naomi lived inside that rhythm the way a fish lives inside water, hardly noticing the miracle of it. She tallied small comforts, how the gate creaked like an old uncle, how the mango tree leaned toward the compound as if it was listening, how the women who sold tomatoes on the corner called her accountant because she never haggled past fairness. On the day she met Marcus, Balagan Market was a roaring throat made of fabrics and voices. Rappers flapped like flags, men argued over bolts of lace with the intensity of priests, and the sun lay upon shoulders like a stubborn child refusing to get down. He leaned on a delivery van as if the metal was a joke only he understood, smile easy, elbows dusty, the kind of presence that made you think of Saturday errands that turn into Sunday stories. He asked for directions, and then gave them back to her in compliments, and even though she knew better than to be swept by a breeze, something in his talk felt like the first sip of cold water after a long queue. They went for coffee on the island, where the lagoon pretended to be a tame animal and ships snorted like bored bulls. He spoke of runs to Port Harcourt, quick turnarounds in Calabar, night drives that made the city's lights look like beads thrown by a generous spirit. He laughed easily, and his laugh tasted like ripe pawpaw, sweet, a little messy, and not meant to last on the tongue. Still, when he listened, he did it with his whole face, as if each word she offered might be a key, and that kind of attention can make a person lean in without knowing they're already falling. He said he was between contracts, and somehow the phrase came out dressed like opportunity instead of worry, like a shirt that looks crisp even when it hasn't seen an iron. He carried keys that chimed when he shifted, a pocket full of promises that sounded like a small wind chime in good weather. Naomi told him numbers soothed her the way hymns soothe old bones, that spreadsheets felt like orderly neighborhoods where trouble didn't roam, and he teased her in gentle pidgin. You be madam for figures, now you day tell money to sit down. And she found herself laughing because, in that moment, laughter was a bridge with no toll. Lagos moved around them with its usual stubbornness, Danfo buses beating the road like drums, hawkers balancing miracles on their heads, the whole city shining with sweat and hope and the impatience of children at dismissal time. Still, their little bubble held, the way a palm can hold water for a heartbeat before it slips through the lines. The first request came wrapped in morning softness, after a week of phone calls that stretched into bedtime and voice notes that arrived like rain at the window. His hands slid round her waist in that kitchen that smelled of beans and bleach, and his voice wore the tone of a man asking the road for forgiveness. "Just help me cover this weekend's dispatch fee," he murmured, like it was a fly she could shoo away with one flick. "By next week, I go balance you, I swear." And she, who measured life in tidy columns, told herself that love is a market where two traders shade each other when the sun misbehaves. She said yes because saying yes felt like placing a small stone on the side of a scale that already knew its duty. Because partnership is a canoe and sometimes your side meets the current first. The money, small, not enough to raise a chorus, left her account like a polite guest who promises to return with cake. She noticed how temporary sat in his mouth like a well-behaved word, how his certainty made doubt feel like a rude visitor, and she told herself that bridges are built from many planks and not every plank needs to be perfect. In the days that followed, she learned the shape of his step on the stairs, the smell of engine oil hidden under his cologne, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when a story needed a place to land. If Lagos is a drum, then these were the quiet taps between the beats, the little signals that tell you the big sound is coming, whether you like it or not. She didn't fall all at once. She walked into it the way one walks into heat at noon, slowly, knowing it's there, adjusting with each breath, telling the skin to cooperate. He sent her photos from a papa, where containers sat like stubborn elephants, each box a secret with steel lips. He called from under a flyover, when rain clogged the gutters and traffic added more mouths to its long complaint. and his voice arrived with the patience of a mechanic coaxing a bolt to turn. "Naomi, you get mind," he would say, admiration folded into the sentence like crayfish into soup. "The way you day arrange life, sweet me." And even though she understood that words can be drummers, good at noise, lazy at labor, she let herself believe because belief, like acra fresh from oil, is hard to resist while it's still warm. Sundays found them walking along the marina where old stories lean on new buildings, eating roasted corn whose smoke wrote soft letters on the air, exchanging the sort of future talk that stitches clouds into fabric. A quiet flat in Suralire where mornings would smell like bread and evenings like soap, a fridge humming with dignity, a dining table that understood birthdays and apologies. When he was late, he arrived with buns and a grin, and she told herself that lateness is not always disrespect, but sometimes simply Lagos doing Lagos, roads folding into themselves like pounded yam in the hands of an expert. He kissed her forehead and said thank you in 3 different tones, each tone a ribbon tied around the same box, and the box, for a time, felt full. Her friend Isla from Acadia, who had the eyes of someone who can count a person's heartbeat by watching their wrist, asked harmless questions that carried sharp teeth. "And you, were you day inside this your story?" Naomi smiled, shrugged, served tea, and changed the subject to the price of tomatoes, which had started behaving like celebrities, appearing where and when they pleased. Yet in the quiet after phone screens went dark and generators mumbled themselves to sleep, she would gather numbers like shells and lay them in a line in her mind. A small transfer here, a tidy contribution there, the promise of next week standing politely behind each request, hands folded, waiting to be called. Markets teach patience in ways churches envy, and Balagan had become their second chapel. He liked to show her the stalls as if they were cousins, telling stories about the man who measured cloth with his eyes alone, about the woman who sold head ties tight enough to hold secrets, about the pot of pepper stew an apprentice once upended with a sneeze, baptizing passers-by in red. She listened and held the corners of his anecdotes the way a tailor holds fabric that might slip, firmly with care, refusing to be cut by surprise. His days were full of hustles shaped like promises and promises shaped like hustles, and she learned to nod at the proper places, to separate noise from news. Once, by Philomo Bridge, the sunset performed a miracle with mango colors, and Marcus said, "See a sky day dressed to kill for our sake." And she thought, if beauty can be this careless with its gifts, maybe generosity is not an error but a climate. He spoke of booking, permits, gate passes, the choreography of men who waved trucks in and out like traffic wardens at a wedding. When he said temporary, it sounded as if the word had washed its hands and put on perfume, as if tomorrow was standing at the door rehearsing a pleasant knock. She helped because her hands knew how to help, because in Lagos, everyone is somebody's ladder at least once, and a ladder does not complain when feet remember where to step. When she transferred funds, the alerts arrived with that brisk bank voice, tidy as a waiter who refuses to sit. Each message felt both small and significant, like a grain of rice that somehow knows it belongs to a feast. She balanced her own ledgers with the precision of a seamstress fitting a difficult bodice, telling herself that strong cloth does not fear a needle. Yet she kept her eyes open, not to accuse but to understand, because understanding is a torch that doesn't burn the hand holding it. On afternoons when the light fell into their favorite cafe like a generous aunt, they shared puff-puff and carried on the slow ritual of inventing a life, and every so often the city outside would bang its pots. Sirens that sounded like gossip, horns that argued like uncles, laughter from strangers that made her spine remember joy. And she would think, this is how a story grows, step by certain step, with detours that wave as they pass, with kindness that sometimes arrives dressed like need that sometimes pretends it is only passing through. Marcus's request came again on a humid Thursday morning, when the city still wore the tiredness of the night's rain. Clouds sat low above the buildings in Anthony Village, and the smell of wet sand mixed with the scent of frying akara drifting from the roadside kiosk near their street. Naomi had just returned from the small open market at the junction, a bag of vegetables slung on her arm, when Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter in that casual way he had mastered, phone in one hand, the other drumming lightly against his thigh. "Just small help again," he began, voice draped in the same easy charm that had once made her laugh at everything he said. "Dispatch man day worry me about this weekend consignment. If I no settle him now, he go spoil my deal. I fit return am by next week sharp. His eyes were wide with an earnestness that might have fooled her months ago, but now they reminded her of the street boys in Balagan Market, quick to flash sincerity before the price was finalized. Naomi set the vegetables on the counter, not looking at him immediately, letting the sound of rainwater dripping from the eaves fill the gap. The numbers had been shifting lately, a payment here, a promise there, like puzzle pieces that refused to lock, and she had felt it in the same way you feel a seam straining under cloth. "How much?" she asked finally, her voice level, betraying neither suspicion nor trust. He smiled, stepping closer, his hand brushing her waist as if affection could be a receipt for the debt. She transferred the money while the steam from the boiling yam fogged the window, and he kissed her cheek with a murmur about partnership, as if the word could stretch to cover all sorts of holes. When he left, the kitchen felt larger, quieter, the kind of quiet that has questions in it. Naomi washed the vegetables slowly, the knife tapping against the wooden board, her mind running its own ledger that was beginning to tell a story she had not signed up to read. By the weekend, the sun had returned with a vengeance, turning the streets of Lagos into a bright stage where everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Naomi sat under the shade of a red umbrella outside a small cafe in Victoria Island, watching the lagoon shift and glitter beyond the railings. She was supposed to be meeting Titi, an old friend from her university days, who now worked with a logistics firm near Broad Street. Titi arrived in her usual burst, loud greetings, warm hugs, and an immediate complaint about traffic. They ordered iced coffee, the clink of the glass against the metal table sharp in the afternoon heat, and after a few minutes of catching up on mutual acquaintances, the conversation slid toward work, then money, then men, in the natural way such talks often do. Naomi spoke carefully, mentioning only in passing that Marcus had been taking on some tricky deals, and that she had been helping here and there. Titi tilted her head, the way a person does when they are hearing more than is being said. "Helping or funding?" she asked with a half-smile that was more warning than joke. Naomi laughed lightly, but inside she felt the words settle uncomfortably, like stones in a pocket. Across the street, Danfo buses rattled past, conductors hanging out the sides and shouting for passengers to CMS, their voices rising above the honks and the chatter of passers-by. A vendor selling roasted plantain fanned the coals, the smoke drifting into the air, carrying that familiar sweet burnt smell. They talked for another hour, skirting deeper truths, and when they parted, Titi's hug lingered just long enough to say, "Be careful," without having to say it aloud. Naomi walked toward the car park with the late sun painting the buildings gold, thinking about how even in the busiest parts of Lagos, warnings have a way of finding you in the quiet between conversations. 2 days later, Naomi found herself in Ikeja, standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle of a bustling pharmacy. She had come to pick up some toiletries and painkillers, but ended up at the counter speaking to Mama Ife, a pharmacist she'd known since her teenage years. They had always exchanged small talk, the weather, the rising price of milk, the best cream for harmattan skin. But that day, the conversation wandered into heavier territory. Naomi mentioned in a careful, almost offhand way that she might have to delay buying something, because Marcus had been using more of their shared funds lately. Mama Ife, stocky and warm-faced, looked up from the register and fixed Naomi with a gaze that cut through the buzzing noise of the pharmacy. "My Pekin, if a man's need never finish, you go use your life pay she said, her voice low but firm. Behind them, the sliding door hissed open and closed as customers came and went, the sounds of the street, hawkers calling, Okada horns blaring, rushing in for brief moments before being shut out again. Naomi forced a small laugh, shrugging, as if the words had landed softly. But when she left, bag in hand, the weight of the advice seemed to follow her into the bright Ikeja afternoon, where the air smelled faintly of fried puff-puff and petrol. She walked slowly back to her car, her mind playing back Mama Ife's words the way a song repeats in your head without permission, each repetition asking a question she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. That night, after dinner, Marcus was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone, while Naomi sat at the small table in their living room, the glow from the single bulb above casting a pale circle on her open notebook. She had begun keeping track, not just of the amounts she transferred, but of the dates, the reasons, the promises of repayment. It was something she hadn't planned. It had started one evening, when she'd felt a sudden urge to see the pattern laid out plainly. Now, the pages told a story that felt less like partnership and more like erosion. Marcus glanced over once or twice, asking what she was writing, but she waved him off with a vague answer about work. The night outside was alive with Lagos's usual chorus, distant generator hums, a bus conductor shouting for a last passenger, the faint beat of music from a nearby compound. But inside, There was only the quiet scratching of her pen. She underlined a date, then drew a line connecting it to another, watching the web form, each line a link in a chain she had not agreed to wear. When she finally closed the notebook, Marcus had fallen asleep on the couch, phone still in his hand, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of someone untroubled. Naomi turned off the light, leaving the room in darkness, but the shapes of her notes seemed to glow behind her eyelids as she lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the city breathe. The city wore its Monday face when she put the first deposit down, a surreal morning full of generator coughs and the scent of ironing starch drifting out of tailor shops, and Naomi felt a steadying calm seeing her name on the receipt, black ink like a firm handshake that didn't sweat, while the hall manager, a rail-thin man with a laugh like coins rattling in a tin, promised backup power, sober security, and chairs that wouldn't wobble under aunties who danced with their whole history. She walked the tiled floor imagining it full of cousins, the clatter of plates, the soft scrape of gelly as women leaned close to bless her, and for a brief second the future arranged itself like well-folded ankara in a merchant's stall, neat, bright, and waiting. Yet Lagos never lets a picture hold still for long, and outside the hall gates the afternoon stretched like melted sugar on traffic, Danfo buses arguing with horn in hand, Okadas weaving needle-thin paths between impatience and potholes so that when Marcus appeared in his scuffed sneakers, smell of engine oil hiding under borrowed cologne, he wore the grin of a man who'd outrun a small disaster and wanted applause. He swung an arm around her shoulders and said all the right things. How the hall had presence. How the sound would bounce nicely for the band his friend could organize for something light. How the bathroom smelled clean, as if fragrance could be evidence of integrity. And she let him narrate, because narration was his strongest muscle, and hope, once it starts humming, can drown out every other radio in the room, though she kept a quiet accountant's eye on the edges. The way his smile deflated when the manager mentioned the balance due a week before the date, the way his phone lit with messages he refused to open, the way his thumbs rubbed each other as if notes could be coaxed from empty pockets. Later, under the awning of a buka where stew boiled with the loud contentment of a satisfied gossip, they ate rice that tasted like the color red and laughed about the aunt who would bring 5 uninvited choir members because praise has no guest list. And when the bill came she reached first, not to embarrass him but to keep the moment from buckling, telling herself that love is like a compound tap. You open it slowly, learn the water's temper, and only then fill the bucket to the brim. He insisted on handling the car, and the insistence wore cologne, swaggering across sentences that tried to be humble but kept winking at themselves. No walla, I get person way day do us correct price. And she allowed it because allowances are the small oils that keep a partnership from grinding, while she took the lists, the ones that bloom like weeds around a Nigerian wedding, and bent them to her will. Plates and cutlery hired from a woman in Lyanson, who refused to haggle because my things no be follow come. A DJ who spoke in assurances and playlists. Gelly girls already booked for 3 other events but promised to touch ground small. Church forms stamped after a deacon searched for a pen like a man searching for peace. Days grew hands and pulled them both through markets where fabric talked louder than buyers, past bread stalls in Ojalegba, where the air smelled like sugar learning to be responsibility, into a small studio on Adinaran Ogunsanya, where a seamstress measured Naomi with a tape that had seen many bodies and kept their secrets without complaint. In that mirror-lit room with pins shining like shy stars, she chose a dress that didn't punish breath, satin that moved like a kind rumor, and Aunt Ruth came from Lecky with eyes that missed nothing and mouth that knew when to stay shut, touching seams, nodding once, then twice, then saying only, "E good," which from Ruth was as loud as a band. Marcus kept trimming costs with jokes so smooth they slid into acceptance. No need for florist, we fit borrow garden from my guy for Anthony. Photographer ku, my potty sabi phone pass all these people. MC na small thing, I fit hold mic. And Naomi learned how to hear the hollow inside such humor, measuring the jokes by the shadow they cast on the wall. Yet she did not break pace, because Lagos trains you to walk and think, to greet and calculate, to carry daylight on your head without spilling, and at night, when the generators hum ironed out the room, she would write in a small notebook with faint blue squares, not the wedding checklist, the other one, the ledger nobody knew about, where dates lined up beside amounts in each. I go balance you next week, sat like a seat marker, polite and expectant, and though the sums were not monstrous, they had learned to multiply hope by delay, so she gave them names that meant nothing if someone else ever saw the page, labels like rain, ladder, and bridge, which told her enough to remember who brought the umbrella, who climbed, and who was simply crossing. In the hush of an overcast Wednesday, with rain making promises it didn't immediately keep and the city moving like a man in slippers, she decided to check what had never needed checking, not out of suspicion, as suspicion eats kinship in tiny bites, but because the ledger had begun to look like a night road with fewer streetlights. So she opened her banking app, checked balances, moved small amounts into a savings pocket labeled with a joke she and Isla once made, plantin' money, and then like someone turning a key in a door they had always assumed would open to the same room, she typed her name into a credit portal and waited while dots spun, believing it would be a short pause with nothing at the end but confirmation's mild smile. The page loaded with the efficiency of a trained usher, and there it was, a Van Lease sitting beside her name like an uninvited guest with a loud cough, digits lined up as if they'd been practicing marching, due dates that didn't match her calendars, memory, and an email address that looked like hers after a mischievous child swapped 2 letters, and went to sleep satisfied. The first sensation wasn't anger but a coolness at the back of her neck, the way air feels when a door opens behind you in a church, and she copied the reference numbers carefully, each stroke of the pen a quiet drumbeat, then called the company in Apapa, where a woman named Yajide answered with a professionalism that sounded like a starched shirt. Naomi's voice traveled steady across the line, a canoe in no hurry, asking the kind of questions that leave no place to hide. When was the contract signed? Through what contact? By which confirmation? And could Yajide kindly read the authorizing email character by character? The wrongness grew legs as consonants rearranged themselves like children caught stealing chin-chin, and Yajide, to her credit, didn't dress the truth in lace. She said a message had come from an address that wore Naomi's face like a borrowed gelly, that the co-signer had acknowledged receipt, in a follow-up reply sent at 2:11 a.m., that a file sat on their desk with scanned forms carrying a signature similar enough to fool a tired eye. Then her voice softened the way Lagos voices do when they find the edge of compassion, promising to flag the account pending a formal dispute. Naomi thanked her, ended the call, and stood for a long moment at the kitchen window, where rain finally kept its word and fell, little needles stitching the compound sand back together, while inside her a quiet animal lifted its head and looked around. Not panic, not yet, just awareness stretching its back and sharpening its claws on the nearest tree. She did not stage a war cry, or drag his name to the court of family chatter. Lagos teaches a different kind of bravery, one that looks like a woman buying groundnut and counting her change twice while remembering which bus to wave down. So she made tea in a chipped mug with a handle smoothed by years, sat at the table with the pale wooden scar like a river on a map, and laid out photocopies the way an ant spreads cloth to catch sunlight, calling Isla first because Isla's calm could tame goats, explaining in a voice that bent but didn't break, and Isla said only, "Send me everything. We go take him line by line." While WhatsApp delivered small green ticks that felt like hand squeezes, Aunt Ruth arrived that evening with bread and silence, opened the bread, sliced it like she was cutting rope, and listened without seasoning the story with her own flavor, then asked 3 questions that landed like gentle stones. What could be frozen without harm? Who needed to be informed quietly? And when would be the safest hour to move what must be moved? By morning, Naomi had shifted funds into an account with a name as boring as rain, updated passwords with combinations that meant something only to her, found the credit union counselor number through a friend who owed her nothing and therefore could be trusted, and printed forms that asked for truth without drama. Her hands shook once, like a small bird testing its wings, and then steadied as if the air itself had agreed to hold her. When Marcus came by that afternoon, bringing stories about a traffic stop that was really a bribe that was really a joke, she watched the way his mouth curved around temporary, saw how the word strutted, and she placed a cup of tea before him, thick with milk the way he liked, smiling in a manner that revealed nothing except that she knew how to be kind without being blind, letting the conversation skip across stones away from money and toward music, since good plans prefer quiet rooms, and that night, the generator hummed a lullaby that sounded like a pact with herself, not to blow everything up in a blaze that would leave only ashes, but to build a slow, careful path through the forest, marking trees with small cuts, memorizing the bend of branches, teaching her feet how to walk away while appearing to stand still. The day started with the sky wearing the pale, dusty blue of a Lagos morning that had not yet decided whether to sweat or to pour, the air thin enough for the smell of bread from the street vendor to drift through the compound gate and coil into Naomi's room, where Aunt Ruth's voice, low and brisk, was moving through a list of instructions about pins, powder, and the timing of the hair stylist who was already setting up in the small parlor. The house felt like a pot just before a boils steam, rising but not yet breaking into bubbles, and Naomi sat by the window while the makeup artist dusted her cheekbones, watching two young boys chase each other past the front wall, their bare feet tapping the ground like tiny drums, thinking how strange it was that all this movement, lace being smoothed, gelly folded like origami, phone calls buzzing between cousins, was aimed toward an hour that had already started to feel like a picture she'd seen before, something glossy and slightly out of reach. The dress hung in the corner like a well-fed queen, its folds whispering every time someone walked past, and Ruth kept circling back to check on it as if silk could suddenly decide to wrinkle itself in rebellion. From the street came the layered Lagos orchestra, horns shouting at slow cars, hawkers singing the virtues of cold mineral in the heat, the occasional impatient roar of an Okada squeezed by traffic. Marcus was supposed to be at the registry early to settle small matter, as he'd put it the night before, and would meet her at the hall later, but Naomi's mind returned again and again to the folded photocopies in her clutch, the little brass hairpin tucked into her veil by Isla with a wink. For when you want to feel like James Bond, a beg. And the pineapple emoji agreed upon days earlier as a silent flare if the road bent the wrong way. She stepped into the gown and felt its weight settle on her like a reminder, not oppressive but certain, and when she looked in the mirror she did not see the glitter of a fairy tale. She saw a woman fully aware that the script was not the one being read aloud in the room. By the time Tom's call came, his voice tight with that false cheer people use when they are hiding a limp, saying he was outside with the car, the veil was already pinned, the bouquet already in her hand, and the morning had become a current she decided to let carry her, if only because sometimes the safest way through deep water is to float until you see a shore you recognize. The car was a dark sedan that smelled faintly of fuel, and the cologne men wear to Sunday service when they want to be noticed without explanation, its back seat wide enough to swallow her gown in careful folds, and Tom, sitting in the driver's seat, greeted her with a smile that did not stay long on his face before sliding off like a bead of water on glass. He waited for her to settle, adjusted the mirror as if checking traffic, but his eyes flickered briefly to hers, and then away, the kind of flicker that carries a message it doesn't dare speak. They pulled out into the late morning traffic, heading past shop fronts still pulling up their metal shutters, women sweeping the dust from in front of their stalls with brooms made of bound twigs, kiki drivers arguing over who had the right to a particular spot, and for a while the familiar rhythm of Lagos roads, stop, creep forward, stop again, held her in its hypnotic sway. She knew the path to Surleur's Hall by heart, the bakery with the sign missing an A, the bus stop where a preacher always shouted into the dawn, the street where the jacaranda trees scattered purple flowers like confetti. But after a few turns, she realized the bakery had not appeared, the preacher's bench was nowhere in sight, and instead Tom was guiding the car onto a road lined with warehouses, their gates locked, their walls painted with fading adverts for cement and beer. She let her eyes drift to the door handle, to the clutch on her lap, to the hairpin pressing gently against her head, then to Tom's hands on the wheel, steady, but with fingers tapping an uneven beat. "Shortcut," he said without prompting, as if he could feel her thoughts trying to gather shape. She hummed in response, neither agreement nor protest, and shifted the bouquet slightly to free her phone from beneath its stems, the motion slow, deliberate, practiced from nights of imagining what might need to be done if the wrong road ever tried to claim her. Through the tinted glass, the city looked the same to anyone not paying attention. Street hawkers still at their stations, bikes still weaving through impossible spaces. But Naomi was counting turns, counting minutes, mapping silently, the numbers as clear in her mind as any account sheet she had balanced. They passed a junction where she knew they could have turned toward familiar ground, but Tom kept straight, his jaw working like a man chewing over a confession, and the street narrowed, the buildings leaning in as if to listen. She slid her thumb over her phone screen without looking, opened the chat with Isla, and pressed the pineapple emoji, sending it with the same calm as if she were confirming the price of tomatoes. The action brought no relief. This was not a magic charm, but it marked a line between before and after, between waiting for the world to act and quietly setting its gears in motion. Outside, the shops gave way to the skeletal frames of unfinished buildings, rebar rusting under the sky, puddles collecting where the road sagged. Tom's voice broke the quiet, lower now, less certain. "We got stopped somewhere small," he said, not meeting her eyes. She asked nothing, letting silence stretch until it became a third passenger, and in that silence she remembered the beer parlor night when Tom's mouth had finally loosened, telling her about Darcy from Worry, about debts that had shape and smell, about Marcus's charm turning thin under pressure, about promises to fix it that sat unfulfilled like bad checks. It had been Tom's voice that wove the threads of a plan, slow, deliberate, without heroics, one that required him to play his part convincingly until the day came when a turn off the map could be used for more than mischief. Now, with the city's heat pressing in through the windows and the faint thud of bass from a passing car, Naomi knew the day had arrived in the most ordinary disguise, and she leaned back against the seat, letting the rhythm of the road and the steady growl of the engine be the only sounds, because sometimes the quietest hour is when the most important work is being done. The sedan slowed as they approached a stretch of road where the traffic thinned unexpectedly, the noise of the city falling behind like a quarrel you've walked away from, and Naomi could feel the shift in the air, an opening in the pattern, the kind of gap a careful mind can step into without drawing attention. She kept her eyes half on Tom, half on the passing storefronts until she recognized the squat, mirrored facade of a bank in Victoria Island, its doors guarded by two uniformed men who leaned on their rifles the way old men lean on canes. The decision came not as a burst but as a continuation of the plan already set in motion days ago. She placed the bouquet on the seat beside her, adjusted her veil as if checking her reflection, and when the car stopped at the curb she opened the door before Tom could speak, her heels clicking a steady beat up the tiled steps toward the cool shadow of the lobby. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished floors and the faint hum of machinery, and heads turned, not in shock, but with the quiet curiosity Lagos reserves for sights it can't immediately price. Yet no one spoke as she approached the counter, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly which paper to pull from a bag. She asked to freeze the joint account, to flag certain transfers, to attach the fraud report to the van lease she never signed, each request laid out in the precise order she'd practiced in her head, and behind the counter a woman in a navy jacket nodded, typed, printed, stamped, her movements brisk but not unkind. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, Marcus was still a man walking toward a wedding he didn't yet realize was over, and Naomi, in the bank's small, air-conditioned belly, was a woman drawing lines that would not be crossed again, each signature a step toward a door she would leave by her own choosing, with or without the dress still sitting perfectly on her shoulders. The security man held the door as if he were guarding a story that had decided to change its ending, and the lobby swallowed the noise of Lagos the way a big river swallows a small canoe. Naomi stood inside that cool brightness with her veil lifting and falling like a quiet breath, watching the teller's fingers walk across the keyboard with the certainty of a woman who knew where every gate in the fence belonged. "Please freeze the joint account," she said, laying out photocopies whose corners were sharp with intention. "Flag these transfers, attach my affidavit to the van lease I did not authorize, and record my dispute on the profile." The banker, name tag reading Imelda, did not perform pity, she performed process, and there was mercy in that. Stamp, initial, print, slide, explain, the choreography of a system that, for once, did not ask a woman to beg for common sense. A supervisor came, crisp like a new note, checked the forms, nodded at Naomi's careful dates, and said, "We can place an investigative hold for 72 hours, which felt like someone placing a hand on a door just as a thief reached for the knob. In the reflection of the glass, Naomi saw Tom hovering by the entrance, cap in both hands, eyes devoted to the floor as though answers might be hiding in the tiles. He looked like a boy who had broken a window and was ready to count the shards. "We go wait small," he muttered when she rejoined him for a moment, and she squeezed his elbow. A small blessing, a small absolution, the kind you give to men who chose to tell the truth before the truth exposed them. Back in the small office, Imelda offered water and called someone in fraud, a woman named Nkem whose voice had the steady warmth of charcoal that's been glowing a long time. "Let's clean this up," Nkem said, and Naomi felt the ground beneath her shoes stop pretending to be a trap and become simply a floor again. It was not triumph, it was alignment, the feeling a zipper has when it finally finds the proper teeth. She signed where needed, noted the case number, and sent a single line to Isla. "Pineapple received," which came back instantly with a green heart and the words, "I day outside." Lagos, for its part, kept moving beyond the glass. Hawkers selling airtime, office workers marching back to desks, the afternoon sun polishing car hoods as if money were a mirror, unmoved by the quiet emergency of one woman's life becoming her own again. She didn't hear Marcus enter so much as feel the air sharpen around his outline, the way a room does when thunder clears its throat. He strode in half smile, half sweat, phone in his palm like a talisman, the suit he had borrowed a touch too eager at the shoulders, and when his eyes landed on the papers in front of her, mischief flinched and calculation took the stage. "Nay," he began, voice softening into the old music. "Wouldn't be all this? We day late." She held his gaze with the patience of a queue that knows each person will move when it is time, then shifted the top page so he could read the bolded words. Account hold, fraud dispute, investigation opened. The color drained from his certainty. "You no suppose do 'em like this," he said, trying for wounded and landing on worried. "I forsort everything today. Darcy don day reason me. We forgo registry first then. And use my family's envelope money to buy one more week of quiet?" Her tone did not rise. It walked level, step after careful step, across the exact stones that would get her to the other side. He reached for her hand, and she let his fingers touch air. "Marcus," she said in a voice a person uses with a friend they do not intend to visit again, "I believe you meant to fix it. Meaning is not the same as doing." Tom shifted in the doorway, small as a comma and just as necessary, and when Marcus swung toward him, accusation already lighting a match, Tom spoke before flame could find fuel. "Nami drive turn," he said, cap twisting, shame sitting in his collar like a stubborn heat. "But na she planned this rescue." "I agree." Marcus blinked, the swagger crumbling like old bread. He always had backups, a joke to oil the hinge, a story to distract the guard, a compliment to tip the scale. But the vault he'd counted on was closed, and the keys that used to jingle in his pocket had become useless songs. He tried one last door. "I love you," and Naomi accepted the sentence as a statement about weather. "I know," she said, not cruel, just finished. "And like rain, it comes when it wants and leaves when it chooses. Today I am looking for roofing, not riddles." She slid the ring from her finger, watched it roll a half-inch on the desk and settle, a small moon deciding on a modest orbit, and for a heartbeat grief fluttered its wings in her chest, not for the man as he stood, but for the version of him they had both pretended could arrive if they kept the porch light on. The fraud officer joined them, precise in language and gentle in eye contact, and the conversation left the territory of feelings to walk the grid of facts. Dates stamped by servers, IP addresses tied to a location in a papa near the yard, email headers revealing the clumsy switch in Naomi's address, a voice memo attached to one request that caught 3 seconds of background radio, pigeon news about a tanker spill on Eco Bridge, like a fingerprint left by a song. "We will file the necessary notices," Nkem said, "and the lease company has indicated willingness to place a provisional block while signatures are authenticated." Marcus started to protest, but the room had lost its appetite for his improvisation. Even his words looked tired, dragging their feet like school children in heat. Naomi asked 2 questions, the type that have only answers, not opinions. What additional documents would keep the freeze clean, and who would receive updates so she would not be forced to chase dust? Imelda printed a neat list, offered a courteous nod to the bride who had come to a bank rather than a hall, and excused herself to the soft-click world beyond the glass. In the hallway, Aunt Ruth materialized as if conjured by the smell of trouble, cardigan folded over her arm like a second spine. She did not glare at Marcus, did not stage a sermon. She simply placed the cardigan on Naomi's shoulders, fastening the top button with the competence of someone who has closed many doors that needed closing. "Time to be warm," she said, and the sentence covered more distances than cloth. Isla slipped in behind, her look to Marcus the exact opposite of flirtation, clean, flat, final, and then her eyes softened on Naomi, as if to say, "We are still here." Tom muttered, "I go handle Darcy gist, I go talk, I go pay when I fit," and Naomi believed him because his remorse had stopped auditioning and started working. The ring on the desk caught a square of sun and made a thin coin of light on the paperwork. Lagos outside sent a new chorus through the glass. Lunch hour rising, generators catching, a bus conductor's howl braided with laughter, and the whole sound felt like permission to keep going. They left as a group that did not look like a procession, but moved with the intention of one, Ruth walking slow enough to keep dignity unruffled, Isla a half step behind in case the hem needed saving, Tom lingering by the door to absorb any final sparks of male pride that might try to leap. Marcus followed, saying nothing now, each silence a confession he would never fully voice. At the curb, the heat met them like an old creditor, and Naomi inhaled its demand without flinching. She could feel the city's momentum tug at her ankles. Go, go, go. But she arranged time to her own tempo, lifting her dress, placing her feet, letting the afternoon stretch long enough for meaning to catch up. A bus roared past, conductor hanging out the side like a flag, calling for Oberland, voices overlapping in the democratic noise that is Lagos's true anthem. Naomi's mouth twitched into a small smile that did not belong to anyone else's performance. "I will send the case number to you," she told Marcus, formality turning his name into a door with no handle on his side, "and a list of people to call who are not me." He nodded, a man counting losses the way a bookmaker counts small debts, grudgingly, but with respect for arithmetic. There was no scene, no public tears. Drama is sweet but it stains, and Naomi had a new fabric to keep clean. She and the women crossed the sidewalk as if it were a quiet river, stepped into a taxi that smelled of lemon and seatbelt, and pulled away without looking back, because sometimes love is not a person but the act of leaving your own rescue intact. The driver, old enough to have stories but young enough to enjoy telling them, glanced in the mirror and, seeing the veil and the cardigan share a shoulder, chose silence, the finest courtesy a stranger can give. At a red light, a hawker lifted cold water to the window, and Ruth bought 3, pressing one into Naomi's hand as if it were a certificate. "Drink," she said. Naomi did, the plastic collapsing with each swallow, each collapse a small applause for muscles that had done their work well. In the distance, the bank's mirrored skin reflected a sky that would eventually find rain. Inside the cab, her future unclenched like a fist, deciding it no longer wished to hold anything sharp. The taxi rolled into Lekki Phase 1 with the late afternoon sun sitting low enough to turn the lagoon into a sheet of molten copper, its surface wrinkled by the small, busy boats that crossed like impatient thoughts. Naomi sat between Aunt Ruth and Isla, the cardigan now settled on her like a second skin, veil folded neatly in her lap, the bouquet wedged in the corner as if it too needed somewhere to think. The driver took the quieter inner roads where jacaranda blossoms had fallen in lazy purples on the tarmac, and the neighborhood's air, rich with salt from the water and the faint perfume of bougainvillea, was a soft contrast to the noise they'd left behind in Victoria Island. Ruth's flat welcomed them with the scent of fried plantain drifting from a neighbor's kitchen, the hum of an old refrigerator that had seen 3 landlords, and the quick shuffle of her slippers across tile as she moved into host mode without ceremony. She set water to boil, slid a plate of cabin biscuits onto the table, and pulled 3 mugs from the cupboard with the ease of someone who'd been laying out comfort for decades. Naomi removed the dress in the spare room, unhooking it carefully so the seams didn't sigh, and hung it on the back of the door where it stood like a polite guest, silent and waiting. She stared at herself in the mirror, no jewelry now, hair still pinned, eyes heavy but unbroken, and thought of the bank's glass doors closing behind her, the weight of the signed papers in her hand, the ring on the desk catching a slice of sunlight before she walked away. Isla joined her there, leaning in the doorway, saying nothing until Naomi sat on the bed. "You've been holding your breath all day," she murmured, and the words made Naomi exhale in a rush, as if a knot had been loosened without her noticing. Ruth appeared with tea, its steam rising like a thin prayer, and the 3 of them drank in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional honk from the road outside. The world had not collapsed because a wedding did not happen. It had simply continued, reshaping itself around her choice, and there was a steadiness in that fact that felt better than celebration. 2 weeks later, Naomi moved into a small second-floor flat above a bookshop in Suralere, the kind of place where mornings smelled faintly of paper and dust, where the ceiling fan clicked in an uneven rhythm, and where she could watch the street from a balcony without being seen. She unpacked slowly, folding and refolding clothes until each drawer felt like it belonged to her, placing the wedding shoes, never worn beyond the taxi, back into their box and tucking them onto the top shelf as if they were simply another item in her archive of almosts. The bouquet, now dried and brittle, sat in a jar on the windowsill, its faded petals a quiet witness rather than a wound. Work at the office resumed with the same hum as before, spreadsheets, polite greetings, the occasional birthday cake brought in from the bakery downstairs, and colleagues who had been curious enough to ask before now let the matter fade, accepting her vague answer that plans changed, with the understanding Lagos people have for stories too heavy to carry in public. She started taking evening walks along the quieter streets, learning the vendors by name. Mama Chitty, who sold roasted plantain with a smile that reached her eyes, Musa the cobbler, who worked under a tattered umbrella patched so many times it looked like a quilt. On Sundays, she'd visit Ruth for lunch, carrying small groceries as if to repay an unspoken debt, and they'd sit on the veranda eating jollof rice while Ruth recounted old family stories that twisted between humor and warning. Occasionally, she would hear from Tom, always via a short message written in pidgin that carried the weight of someone still chipping away at what they owed, not just in money but in courage. And once, late at night, Marcus's name lit up her phone with a message that read simply, "I'm sorry. I day try." She let it stay unopened, because not every door needs to be opened again, just to confirm it still leads to the same room. By the third month, her routines had become firm enough to stand on. Wake before the first Danfo horns reached her street, make tea, review numbers at work, share an occasional lunch with Isla when their schedules aligned. She joined a small women's group at the community library, not for anything official, but for the comfort of sitting in a circle, where people spoke about budgets and boundaries as though they were recipes to be shared, each woman adding her own spice. They swapped stories of landlords, of school fees, of cousins who called only when their voice had a shadow of request behind it, and Naomi listened, sometimes adding her own thread, sometimes letting the rhythm of others' words do the weaving. She learned how to say no without apologizing twice, how to save small amounts without feeling it was too little to matter, how to enjoy a quiet night without calling it loneliness. The city outside her window continued its restless dance, traffic jams blooming and wilting, sirens cutting through the evening, the occasional street party spilling high-life music into the air, and she let its noise be background rather than a script. Once, passing the old mill hall on her way to the market, she saw it lit up for another couple's celebration, chairs draped in white, music spilling out onto the street in joyous waves. She slowed her step but did not stop, her smile soft and without bitterness, because she understood now that not every destination needs to be hers to admire, and not every turn she could have taken would have led her to the life she wanted to live. On a clear evening in December, she walked along the marina after work, the air smelling of salt and roasted groundnuts, and paused to watch the ferries move across the water with their cargo of commuters leaning against the rails, their faces catching the last light of the sun before it sank behind the skyline. She thought about the months since that morning in the car, how the path she'd taken had not been a straight road, but a series of deliberate steps, each one teaching her where her own weight felt safest. The cardigan Ruth had given her on that day hung now in her closet, worn enough to carry her shape, and every time she touched it she felt the solidity of that moment in the bank, when she'd chosen to draw a line rather than let someone else keep sketching over her life. Lagos shimmered in the distance, its towers catching the gold of evening, its smaller streets already busy with the commerce of night, and Naomi turned toward home with the calm certainty that came from owning her own steering. The road was not free of bends, the weather not always kind, but she knew the map in her hands was hers alone, and whatever turns came next, she would take them with her eyes open, her pace steady, and her heart uncluttered by debts she had not chosen to owe. Life go always give you junctions way you must choose road by yourself. No let anybody you sweet talk carry you go where your spirit no day comfortable. Protect your peace the way person day protect last drop of water for dry season. Love day sweet, but he no suppose blind your eye to truth way day stand in front of you. If something no balance, no fear to step back and reset your steps. Your future go thank you. I pray for you, whoever day hear my voice now. Your hands no go touch trouble way no be your own. May your eyes see every hidden turn before your feet reach am. May your heart find people way go hold you with clean hands and clear mind. Every plan way go waste your joy. You go scatter before you reach your door. You go walk your road with confidence, and your blessings go meet you for every corner. If you believe say now your time to walk in peace. Let me hear you say a big, joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.